Welcome back to the deep dive. We've got some really interesting articles to dig into today about the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, definitely.
Specifically, this whole situation with Ukraine's surprise move into Russia, into Kursk. I mean,
Right, right.
talk about a bold move.
It's wild, right? I mean, invading another country, that's not something you see every day, especially in Europe. And not since, what, World War II?
Exactly. I mean, just to put it in perspective for everyone listening, we're talking about a country that's been at war for over a year, that's been basically fighting for its survival, and they decide to take the fight right back to the enemy's doorstep.
And not just a quick little raid either. We're talking about establishing a military presence in Kursk, holding that ground for weeks.
It's unprecedented, really, and it really
Yeah.
makes you question, like, what is Zelensky thinking? What's the strategy here?
Well, it's risky, that's for sure. But it could be a calculated gamble. You see all these articles about Putin's nuclear threats, the whole red line rhetoric.
Right, right. Like, he put his nuclear forces on high alert at the beginning of the war,
Well,
and there were those statements about consequences you have never faced in history.
exactly. And it's worked to some extent, right? I mean, the West has been really hesitant to give Ukraine certain weapons, like those long-range missiles they've been asking for, out of fear of provoking Putin.
Yeah, you're right. It's like they're walking this tightrope between supporting Ukraine, but also not wanting to trigger a wider conflict, especially one with nuclear weapons involved.
Exactly. It's a terrifying situation all around. But this whole Kursk thing, it kind of throws a wrench in that logic, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, if Putin was really willing to go nuclear, wouldn't this have been the moment? Ukraine invades Russian territory, establishes a military presence. I mean, this is crossing a major red line in his book.
And yet, what do we see? Some missile strikes, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. No nukes. It's almost as if
As if he's all bark and no bite.
maybe that's what Zelensky is trying to prove to the world, to the West especially. Like, look, we're calling his bluff and he's not doing anything about it.
It's certainly a possibility. He's pushing for more military aid, and what better way to make his case than to show that Putin's threats are empty?
There's a quote from Zelensky in one of these articles that really struck me. He said, "We are now witnessing a significant ideological shift, namely the whole naive, illusory concept of so-called red lines."
Wow.
It's like he's saying the old rules no longer apply.
He's definitely not mincing words. But that raises the question, what happens next?
Right, because while Ukraine might be willing to take these risks, the West so far seems to be sticking to their cautious approach. There's this article here, it's quoting John Kirby, the U.S. National Security spokesperson. He says, and I quote, "We've been watching escalation risks since the beginning of this conflict, and that ain't gonna change."
It's understandable, right? They want to support Ukraine, but they also don't want to be responsible for starting World War III. It's a tough position to be in.
For sure. And in the meantime, you have Ukraine, a country fighting for its very existence, seemingly emboldened to take matters into its own hands. It's a situation with no easy answers, that's for sure. But you know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of those articles you shared about Finland, back during the Winter War with the Soviets in 1939.
Right, yeah.
It's like here we have another example of a smaller country facing off against this giant neighbor, having to make these impossible choices about, like, how much are they willing to sacrifice?
And you could really see the parallels, right? Both with Finland and Ukraine, they showed incredible resilience. They fought back against these overwhelming odds, inflicted heavy casualties.
Right, they weren't just going to roll over.
Exactly. But in the end, Finland had to make a tough call. They ceded territory to the Soviet Union in exchange for peace.
And it makes you wonder, is that what Zelensky is thinking here? Could this be a possible endgame for Ukraine? Giving up some land, maybe, but in return, they get security guarantees, a chance to rebuild.
I mean, it's a possibility,
Yeah.
but it's hard to say. Putin's goals in this whole thing have been really hard to pin down, even for people who've been watching him for years.
Right, like what does he actually want? Is he open to any kind of negotiated settlement at this point?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, I haven't come across any clear answers in my research.
Yeah.
But one thing's for sure, this whole Kursk thing, it's like throwing another curveball into an already unpredictable situation.
Totally. And it's not just about Ukraine and Russia anymore, is it? I mean, these articles also talked about how the rest of the world is reacting to all of this. It's like everyone's watching this game of nuclear chicken, wondering who's going to swerve first.
And you have to think, Putin's nuclear threats, they've loomed over global politics for so long.
Right, this idea that he's just like unhinged enough to actually use them.
Exactly. And that fear has been a major factor in how the West has approached this entire conflict.
But now, what if, by not responding more forcefully to this Kursk incursion, Putin has accidentally shown his hand. Like, maybe he's not as willing to push the button as everyone thought.
It's a terrifying thought, in a way.
How so?
Because if the threat of nuclear war starts to lose its power, if it's no longer the ultimate deterrent, then what? Does that make the world more dangerous?
Right, because then everyone might start thinking they can get away with more.
Exactly. And those red lines, those boundaries that seemed so clear before, they could start to blur.
And suddenly you have a whole new set of risks to worry about. And it's not just about Ukraine anymore, is it? Like, you have to think about countries like China, Iran, North Korea.
Well, absolutely. They're watching all of this incredibly closely, taking notes.
Trying to figure how far they can push things.
It's like we're seeing a massive shift in the global power balance right in front of our eyes. The old rules, the old assumptions, they're being tested like never before.
And the big question is, where does it all lead? What happens next? I mean, are we headed for a world where conventional conflicts could escalate much faster, maybe even spiral out of control? Because that nuclear option is no longer off the table.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? And I think it's something that strategists and policymakers are really grappling with right now.
It's like we're in uncharted territory.
Absolutely. But, it's important to remember, amidst all this high-level analysis, that there are real people caught in the middle of all of this. Those articles we were reading, they highlighted the human cost of this war. The lives lost, the families torn apart, the millions displaced from their homes.
It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitical chess game and forget about that.
It's crucial to remember that we're not just talking about abstract concepts here. We're talking about real human lives, real suffering.
And even if the fighting were to magically stop tomorrow, the scars of this war, they're going to run deep for a generation.
Absolutely. The trauma, the loss, the uncertainty is going to have a profound impact on Ukrainian society. And that's something that I don't think we can even begin to fully grasp yet.
It really makes you think about the human cost of all this, doesn't it? And yet, through it all, you see this incredible resilience from the Ukrainians. It's really something.
Yeah, absolutely. They've faced down a much larger enemy, held their ground, and even taken the fight back to Russian soil. You have to admire their determination.
It's like they're rewriting the playbook, not just for how to fight a war, but also for how a nation asserts itself on the world stage. It's inspiring, to be honest.
Definitely. And it makes you wonder, has Zelensky fundamentally changed the game here? I mean, by calling Putin's bluff, by showing that maybe those nuclear threats aren't as credible as everyone thought, has he emboldened other countries who might be facing similar pressures?
That's the big question, isn't it? Has he exposed a weakness in the whole idea of nuclear deterrence? And if so, what does that mean for the future? It's almost like
Like we're entering uncharted territory.
Exactly. The old rules, the old assumptions, they don't seem to apply anymore. It's a bit unnerving, to be honest.
It's definitely something that keeps me up at night. And I'm sure I'm not the only one.
I'd say you're in good company. I mean, all these articles we've been discussing, they all point to this same sense of uncertainty, this feeling that we're at a crossroads. Like, the decisions that are being made right now in Ukraine and Russia and the West, they're going to have ripple effects for years to come.
No doubt about it. And it's hard to predict where it all leads, but one thing's for sure, we can't afford to look away.
Absolutely not. We have to keep asking these tough questions, keep trying to make sense of what's happening, because the stakes are incredibly high, not just for Ukraine, but for all of us.
Well said. And that's what I appreciate about these deep dives we do. It's a chance to really dig into these complex issues, to learn from each other, and hopefully to walk away with a better understanding of the world around us.
Couldn't agree more. So thanks for diving in with me on this one. It's been enlightening, to say the least.
Always a pleasure. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with more deep dives into the most pressing issues of our time. Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep those questions coming.
See you all next time.